You know, there's times in our lives that we're called to make some pretty hard decisions. And those outcomes sometimes can even be a wild card on every level, as we have no idea of how that is going to play out. We just don't have any idea at all. And sometimes in those situations, we're just simply called to speak truth or confront where a loss of a relationship has happened. And there's other times that we're called to act upon something that places us way out of our comfort zone, and yet we continue to feel prompted to do these things, and we feel prompted to move forward with those. And the risk sometimes is great. And then there's those other times that we're called to actually do something, meaning like we're not comfortable with, or even within everything of us is screaming, I don't want to do this. I do not want to go through this. And like, honestly, you just don't want to do it. And we're escaping, we can't escape the feeling that we must. We become compelled, right? We feel compelled to do this. Yes, there's times in our lives over and over again that we're in a place that we have to act and we have to respond. But what if in all of those situations that we find ourselves is a position by providence? Meaning, what if God had orchestrated us to be the one at the right time, at the right moment, with the right people to speak in truth and to lead through our own action and integrity? What would we do? How would we respond, especially with that we may not even want to do that? Would we risk it all? Last week, we began the tremendous story of Esther, one filled with the overarching aspect of God's providence and ultimately will be of the Jewish people's protection while they were living in Persia. And so the setup was introduced last week as to us that this one-time exile girl was now crowned queen of the Persian Empire by that of King Xerxes. And the young lady, she seemingly had favor wherever she went. It was upon her. No matter who she was dealing with, from her attendants to the king himself, she was very well liked. But in all of her dealings so far with others and the contest itself that we looked at last week, even from the king, she kept hidden one thing. And that one thing was her nationality as a Jew, because her uncle had encouraged her to not talk about that. We were also introduced to this uncle, Mordecai, who had adopted her as a child, as a daughter, and brought her in when her parents were killed. And so he was a very instrumental part of her life in getting her initially into that nationwide search for that of a queen. Well, today our story will pick up with a very random moment, it will feel like, of Mordecai that will come back and be instrumental later. So let's look at that. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's instructions, just as she did when she lived in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes, and they plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king and gave it to Mordecai the credit for the report. And when an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. And this was recorded in the book of history of King Xerxes' reign. Now, like I said, this is a very random part of the story. And it would seem very odd that in this story, Mordecai himself has risen in prominence. He's risen in prominence to some degree within the kingdom. His working and serving, as it said, he was at the king's gate, shows that Mordecai had moved into this position where he was a voice with that of decision makers. And he had become a voice of the men of influence within the kingdom itself. And so for legal matters, strangely, back in those days, if you had a legal matter, where did you go? You went to the king's gate in ancient times, and that became much like a court of law where the powers that be would decide what was going to happen. What also is interesting is just simply to consider this plot that he discovered was obviously against a foreign king who had ruled over all of the Jewish people in exile, them and him. And I think it's important to note that his attitude wasn't, well, I'm Jewish and Xerxes is our enemy, so let him kill him. Just let him take him out. Maybe our lives will change. Instead, his thoughts and really his behavior echo the words of Peter, who wrote centuries later that believers, when dealing with and living in this world, Peter said we're to fear God and we're to honor the king, meaning the ruler of the nation. And so both these bold words of Peter speak actually even in a challenge to us for our own lives and how we're to conduct ourselves within that of the secular society we're in, and the expectation even that God has on us, which is living our life in righteousness. And so here is Mordecai doing just that. It really gives a snapshot for us in the story of Mordecai's own personal integrity, which will show itself later again. Well, let's paperclip that story, because that story we will come back to at some point, but because things are about to turn quite dramatically. And more importantly, each section of this storyline continues to build upon one another. Well, as we know, every story, every good screenplay, every movie, there always has to be a good villain, right? There always has to be a good villain. And we're going to be introduced to a doozy of one this morning. So sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all of the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. And all the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. And then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" And they spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show respect, he was filled with rage. And he had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided that it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Isn't that crazy? Crazy. Go after the entire population. Haman the Agagite was a very powerful official, as we've read, with the king. And the disdain between the Jews and Haman's heritage had been at odds for centuries, and it was likely woven even into the fabric of the people. You see, way back when the Israelites were tromping through Egypt, leaving Egypt, and they were coming to the border of the promised land under Moses, God had strict instructions: do not have anything to do with the people of Amalek, which would be the Amalekites. Well, an Agagite, which is what this guy is actually a descendant of the Amalekites. So the decree came after the Israelites had been in war with them in Exodus 17. And from then on, the Jewish people, they stayed clear of any of the Amalekites, and now Agagites' hatred towards the Jewish people as well. And this is where Haman's opinion is on that. So not bowing before Haman became a starting point for a far more sinister response. Yes, not only did Haman's pride take a hit, which it would have, because only one individual, which is crazy, only one decided not to bow, refused to bow, but we see how really mentally demented and deranged that Haman is. For Mordecai will not be the only one to pay for this, but he's going to choose to destroy the entire Jewish race because of it. And more on point, Haman's corruptness is being driven by the centuries of hate behind him between these two people groups. Obsessed with this idea, Haman makes a plan. And cunningly, then what does he do? He calls a meeting with King Xerxes. And in that meeting, he tells half-truths. And he laid out a picture of a people group who were in direct violation to the king. He offered as well in this meeting a significant bribe in order to get what he was looking for. Strangely,